Hello and welcome to Period 7 lecture on interwar foreign policy, and interwar meaning between World War I and World War II. And the traditional thinking is that America turned its back on the rest of the world and isolated itself, and this is a false narrative. They were very active, and if we want to give it a name, maybe independent internationalism, and it's that independent that sort of gets jumbled up into the word isolationist. So they're going to exercise power, but not use military means, and they're not going to get involved in any treaties. So the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and not joining the League of Nations, which was created, this is sort of where the idea of isolationism will come through. And then once things heat up in the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and aggressive actions by Japan, that's when you start to hear a very strong, isolated opinion in the United States of staying out. But there's also very strong voices countering that America should be helping out to resist. So we're going to get sort of two different time periods here, sort of the 1920s, but then we get a new social order in the 1930s with the economic crash of 1929 and the rise of fascism in Europe. So in the 1920s, we definitely see America willing to do arms reduction and encourage others to do arms reduction. A naval treaty with Britain and Japan where they agreed to have smaller navies, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was 62 nations, saying war. This is largely symbolic, maybe just sort of a kiss, an international kiss, you might call it, but you can't legislate war away. If you're attacked, you're going to have to fight back. And then economic stability, looking to try to create an economic stability, but at the same time also having economic nationalism, which is sort of trade protection, high tariffs, me first sort of mentality. And we see this with the Dawes Plan and the insistence on repayment of debts owed and protection of tariffs and these sort of things. All right, so in Latin American policy, it's still happening there, the same traditional policy, the Monroe Doctrine, Europe, you stay out, and then the Platt Amendment and Roosevelt Corollary, which, if you remember, this is sort of America having a very strong influence on these regions. And during this time, they will occupy at one time or another Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Panama, Nicaragua, and Puerto Rico is a straight-up colony. Panama, in a lot of senses, is also really a straight-up colony in Americans' control of the Panama Canal. And they would install puppet regimes to ensure American business interests are protected, that there's not going to be any revolts, there's not going to be any sort of nationalizing of Americans' owned lands, and the kind of business interests very much extraction of metals and agricultural production, particularly fruit, and think of the United Fruit Company. And they installed these people into power and propped them up. That's Trujillo. He was in the Dominican Republic. Somoza in the middle, he is Nicaragua, and that is Bautista, the dictator of Cuba. And as FDR would say, these people might be sons of bitches, but they're our sons of bitches. And so American policy in this region very much not democratic, and it's very much imperialistic. So the two sort of camps that we have in the United States, internationalists and economic nationalists. And this is where I say there's, don't say that the United States was isolationist, because there's a very strong group of internationalists, champions of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points of self-determination, freedom of the seas, collective security. They want to see U.S. financing of European reconstruction, send in American capital. America is flooded with capital at this time. The banks are stuffed, and they want to invest. And they want commercial liberalization, free trade as much as possible, lower down the tariffs, encourage world trade, and international monetary and financial cooperation, not to see any sort of currency wars between two nations, that there's agreed upon international currency and that it's stable. And who are these people? Well, for the most part, those people who have a lot of capital and want to see more trade being encouraged and investment, and particularly in Europe. But then on the other side, there's the economic nationalists, and these are the ones who are sort of isolationist, and but only in the old world, as we see. The Monroe Doctrine still applies. And in the 1930s, they will move to that good neighbor policy in Latin America. Focus on domestic issues. Entry into the war is a mistake, and this is where we say they're economic nationalists, very high tariffs to protect American industry. And who? Well, these are those sectors of the economy with few foreign assets or sales and, labor-intensive steel. They don't sell abroad. They sell in America, so they want to have, America's market sort of protected just for them. And so we've got here a very schizophrenic sort of country. And the division within the United States is going to result in foreign policy that's contradictory. Now, the national government sort of found itself torn between these two conflicting interests. The various economic interests entrenched themselves within government bureaucracies and apparatus. And, for example, the Federal Reserve, the State Department, they're dominated by the internationalists, the financiers. But Congress is very much more closely aligned with those economic nationalists. And so we're going to get contradictory foreign policy. We're going to have a lot of lending into Europe, but then erect high tariffs so that we're not going to purchase from them. That seems sort of counterproductive. And, a monetary cooperation, we want that, but then they're going to sabotage the cooperation at, the London Economic Conference. We want to reconstruct Europe, but then at the same time, we're going to impede sort of reconstruction. So a torn nation with a very muddled foreign policy that seems sort of counterproductive, particularly the first one there, between, the Wall Street bankers and financiers who want to rebuild Europe, but then high tariffs, so we're going to rebuild Europe, but then not buy anything from you, and sort of limit down world trade. That's very counterproductive. So there is a lack of American leadership in reconstructing Europe. So there is one side that said, America should help in reconstruction. And what should this look like? Cancel those war debts, particularly the ones from the U.S. governments. The United States government had made a series of loans to France and Britain and others, about 5 of them altogether, totaling about $10 billion. And these are much larger compared to the other loans that were made by American financiers. Return to the gold standard and stabilize the currency, where everybody's currency is sort of pegged to each other, and so that you've got the value of money is really the same in all nations, and that very much will facilitate better trade. Force the Europeans to reduce German reparations so Germany can invest in itself back into a proper economy, and to have a more stable and moderate government that's not going to be fueled by anger or poverty. And then encouraging a reduction in tariffs in Europe and the United States. So there's very strong voices within the United States government, within the private sector, especially amongst Wall Street and the banks, to do all this, and none of this happened. None of it at all, as Congress sort of said no to any of these, particularly the canceling of war debts. And so in Europe, particularly in Germany, there's economic destabilization, and this could have been averted had the plan had gone through. And this is showing the hyperinflation in Germany, which has a number of interrelated causes that we don't need to go into. And it's American banks and financiers who step up to sort of solve this problem privately with the Dawes plan. So here's how the Dawes plan would work: U.S. investors and Wall Street financiers will give private loans to Germany, who can then use those to invest into their economy and pay off their reparations to France and Britain and the debts as well, and then it'll come back to the U.S. Treasury. And this did work to create stability in Europe, economic stability, and this was implemented around 1924, 1925. And in the next following years, 26, 27, 28, there was a recovered Europe. And you see more American investment in Europe. The amount of foreign direct investment in Europe increases dramatically during this time. But at the same time, American tariffs remained in place, and that was limiting the amount of trade, worldwide trade, that would have been going on at this time. And then it all came crashing down. With the economic crash in 1929 and the subsequent rise of fascism in Germany, Italy was already, Spain, and a much more aggressive Japan, and we get a new dangerous world disorder coming into play. And it's at this time at the London Conference, which was a meeting amongst the leading countries, particularly Britain, France, and the United States, to come up with a coordinated, cooperative monetary policy so that their currencies are stable and that they would all go back onto, the gold standard, where they're all pegging their currency to the supply of gold. And FDR was worried that any agreements would constrain his ability to fight the Depression, and particularly inflation. He was very much printing off money and devaluing, the value of American currency as a policy. And so he just sort of announced, we're not going to do anything. We're out. And it put an end to any monetary cooperation. America's withdrawal greatly upset the world community. It fueled nationalism, and it's going to make any future cooperation more difficult. Now, the United States had also put up a very high tariff right before this, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, and effectively shut off any importation into the United States. And we'll see afterwards the United States will sort of take a softer approach. They will go into reciprocal trade agreements with other nations. You lower your tariff, we'll lower ours. They get a number of those. But we can see the United States sort of taking a me approach with economic problems of the Great Depression, as were others. And it's in this context that we get the rise of these guys. Mussolini, he'd come into power in the 20s. Stalin comes into power about 1928. Adolf Hitler comes into power 34. And Tojo and the Japanese military very much is exercising power by the early 30s. And this only strengthened American isolationists. We don't need to counter these people. The oceans will protect us. Confronting them will only turn, America into them. All right, and here's where we get the aggression of them. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. Manchuria, coal and iron rich. That equals steel. The Japanese install a puppet leader, Puyi, the last emperor of China, and the Americans respond with the Stimson Doctrine. They refuse to recognize this, and they, please don't do this, but nothing really else coming out of it. And the League of Nations issued a protest to Japan. Japan responded by saying to the League of Nations, "See ya," and they formally withdrew from the League of Nations. Now, you could mark this date as the beginning of World War II, which most people say it begins in 1939. But this is really the first of the war, especially if you look at it in an international perspective. Italy evades and occupies Ethiopia, 35. Again, please don't do that. And Germany is aggressively expanding their borders. After Hitler comes in, first thing, he sends in soldiers into the Rhineland, which was not supposed to do. France, Britain, just look on. He annexes Austria. France, Britain, look on. He annexes this area here, German-speaking area of Czechoslovakia, and Britain, France, look on. And when Hitler demands Czechoslovakia outright, this is when Britain responds with what's known as appeasement, saying, "Is that it?" Hitler says, "Yes." "Okay, then." And you can think of appeasement, throwing your friends to the wolves, hoping that their appetite will be sated. In America during this time, this is the isolation argument. Stay out. It's going to destroy democracy here at home. and it becomes the voice of isolation and becomes much stronger. And the arguments bankers, merchants made us join World War One, and a Senate report had sort of confirmed a lot of that, a lot of war profiteering, known as the Nye Commission. FDR decreases foreign involvement during this time, and the Neutrality Acts of 35-36 are passed. And these make it very difficult for America to support any countries of the world. That Americans could not sail on a ship, trade, or make loans to any country involved in the fighting, in any fighting. And there's no distinction between good guys and bad sides in this one. So China, which will be attacked in 1937 by Japan, there's no sort of, hey, that's the Republic of China, a democratically elected Chinese government that is being attacked by this belligerent nation, Japan, or Ethiopia, for example, as being a victim. And you could argue that this is legal but morally irresponsible. And the United States could have, had they put the weight of their power, economic clout that they had, and they could have stood up to these aggressors. So 1937, Japan launches new attack on China. FDR does send some aid to China, but there's really no way to get it there. And this is when he gives what's known as the quarantine speech, and he wants to isolate the aggressors' nations to stop wars. He said we need to quarantine them. And he's sort of hinting, economic blockades or sanctions on these nations. And he's trying to steer the country into a stronger involvement, and this only makes the isolationists angrier and louder at this. And this is when the rest of the world is sort of adopting that, just stop, but nothing really else. The United States starts increasing their military spending at this time, but it's quite small. Still, it's not a great one. Now, it's at this time that Hitler becomes much more aggressive in the late 1930s. Western hope of Germany versus USSR is over with the Hitler-Stalin pact. And it's right after this, Hitler and Stalin made a deal to split up Poland and not fight each other. And we get the attack on Poland. This is traditionally when it's thought that World War II had begun. France and Great Britain declare war, and the United States passes a new Neutrality Act, which is sort of known as cash and carry. We'll sell to you, but you got to carry it yourself. And this is to prevent Americans' shipping being attacked. And for China, this effectively means that they can't get any support at all because of Japanese blockade. And then Germany very quickly advances. 1939, Poland, and then the next summer, 1940, Norway, and iron resources there, and summer 1940, France is gone. And this is quite a big shock, and Great Britain is all alone. There he is. So they were very surprised at the speed that this happened. No stalemate this time. And it's this that shocks a lot of Americans into stronger support, and legislates $37 billion for military, more than World War I, more than the New Deal budget, and we've got a peacetime draft getting going. So FDR steering the country more and more to get involved. But he's still facing a torn nation between the American First Committee, that's the isolationists, and the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, which are the interventionists. And FDR is definitely on the side of interventionists. Congress, not so much. Isolation, still a strong voice. So Britain's all alone. Americans, as I said, are divided. FDR, at this point, without Congress's approval, trades 50 destroyers, naval ships, in exchange for some posts around the world. Germany at this point could have declared war on the United States. This is very much an act of aggression by the United States on one side at the expense of another. FDR is elected, and Wilkie, his opponent, he actually quite respected him and appointed him to prominent positions within the government. And because of the situation, Roosevelt was arguing that's why he should be running again, and then passes Lend-Lease. This is a monumental legislation. The U.S. will lend, notice lend in quotation, basically the United States has legislated that they will be sort of the supply of the Allies in this war, that production is going to be vamped up and you can get all that you want. It is hotly debated, but passed, and hotly debated not just in Congress, but within the public itself. Everybody was sort of discussing this, and $50 billion will be lent, again in quotations, by wars, and it's a gift. And this is what drives the United States out of the Depression. This law right there, the Lend-Lease. Some of the opponents of it. And it would include, once Germany attacked the Soviet Union, it would also include to them, and much to China as well, through Burma as well. And it's at this time that Roosevelt and Churchill meet in the Atlantic Ocean and discuss, their vision for the future is that Germany will be defeated. And they don't really question that. They know it's going to be hard. Japan as well. There must be unconditional surrender, and then correct the mistakes that were made by the United States by not rebuilding Europe afterward. That it's going to be a post-world world of all of Wilson's visions. Wilson's 14 points will be put into effect. Both sides are agreeing on this before the United States is even in the war. The Atlantic Charter. So, if we want to put it in, as a wrap-up, and at the top there, a sort of a thesis statement. As the situation in Asia and Europe became more and more disastrous, the voices of isolation grew louder. However, FDR deftly steered the nation away from isolation and to aid Britain, later China and the United States, as best they could without declaring war. Roosevelt was very much restrained by Congress and by isolationists within the public, and he could only take, step-by-step decisions here. Now, these are all 1939 to 1941, cash and carry. Okay, we'll sell to you, but you got to carry it. We're going to have peacetime draft. Then the destroyers for bases deals. Britain was broke, and this was a way to provide Britain with some badly needed naval supplies. Then Lend-Lease. The United States is full in at this time into the war. And then the Atlantic Charter and an undeclared war in the Atlantic. The Lend-Lease is also, we'll carry it over there for you. And American ships were under attack by German naval forces. America was fighting them right back. And so they were at war, an undeclared war, but they are at war at this time. And then we get Pearl Harbor, and the United States is full in. So keep this in mind, this sort of thesis there of how FDR was able to steer the United States into war. All right, thank you very much for listening. That was a long one.